Huh, that's just how interesting. I guess they just, yeah, they couldn't fire up the Volvos, dude. How curious. Okay, mystery.
At 11:15 p.m.
Oh,
on
Olof
February
Palme?
28, 1986, in downtown Stockholm, longtime Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, and his wife Lisbeth left the Grand Cinema and began walking down Sveavägen Avenue to a nearby subway station to catch a train home.
Rest in
They
power.
had no security detail. The Prime Minister often preferred to go among the public as if he were an ordinary citizen. Passing the Adolf Fredrik Church, they crossed to the east side of the street and continued heading south. They paused to look in a shop window, but only briefly. Then, as they crossed the intersection with Tunnelgatan Alley,
We do stuff like this on Saturday. Gone but not forgotten. Oh, he's definitely forgotten. I feel like any kind of social democracy in this country now is like accompanied with severe austerity. And
even before Mrs. Palme fell to her knees over her husband, Anna Haga stopped at a red light nearby, caught sight of a man collapsed on the sidewalk as a nearby figure dashed into the adjacent alley. Fearing an emergency and being a nursing student herself, she leapt from the car and ran to the man lying on the snow-dusted sidewalk. She saw blood coming from his mouth. This was bad. She reached for his neck. No pulse. She turned him on his back and began chest compressions and attempting mouth-to-mouth. Within moments, a man passing in a taxi, Stefan Glantz, joined her efforts. Neither of them had any idea this was the Prime Minister. This was just an ordinary citizen. After disputing with the victim's wife about the importance of the life-saving efforts, someone else began to try to move the victim's legs, saying he ought to be lying on his side. Anna told him off, saying this man's heart had already stopped. This was all they could do. She was so engrossed in her work, she made no memory of his face.
this is unrelated, but there's so much blood on the bed. On Kaya's bed. It's crazy. This girl is bleeding right now. Jesus Christ. Maybe that's why she's sleeping all the time from the flood. Free bleeding queen. I know. I didn't want to put the diapers back on because she...
Lars Jepsen snapped his head over his right shoulder and saw a man on Sveavägen just ahead fall to the ground into his view. He must have been shot. Then footsteps on the opposite side of Tunnelgatan, but some kind of shed obstructed the source of the noise. Lars turned to look over his left shoulder. A glimpse. Someone, it had to be a man, seemed to fumble with something as he ran toward the nearby stairs. Then, quick as he came, he was obscured again. Lars dashed after the man, who was now bounding up the stairs. Before pursuing him further, Lars stopped and looked at the man lying on the ground. He wondered if he should help, but he saw others rushing to do so. It was up to him to chase the shooter. He went to the stairs, but stopped again at the first step. He didn't want to follow too closely. At the top of the stairs, he saw the shooter pause, only for a split second, and glance over his right shoulder before disappearing. Lars ran as fast as he could, but he never caught another certain glimpse of the shooter. Stig Engström only heard one loud pop as he left his office building at 44 Sveavägen. He figured it was a car's exhaust bang, nothing unusual as downtown noise goes. As he proceeded down the street, after attempting to check his watch, he saw a man lying on the ground, whom he presumed to be a passed-out drunk. A woman was on her knees beside him, asking for someone to call an ambulance. A young man and woman hovered over him. And then he saw the blood coming from the man's mouth. Now he knew something was wrong. The older woman said he was shot, and the killer had run down Tunnelgatten. Engstrom looked down that way and saw the silhouette of a figure standing there against a lighted wall, looking in their direction. He looked back at the body on the ground, then back down Tunnelgatten. The man was gone. Then he tried to help turn the victim on his side to help drain the blood away, but he was already dead. Except Engstrom's story changed a lot. In fact, his behavior became so bizarre and untrustworthy, he eventually became a suspect in Palma's murder. In 2020, Swedish police even pronounced with certainty that he was the murderer. But Engstrom committed suicide in 2000. With nobody to put on trial, after nearly 35 years of active investigation into the murder of one of Europe's most controversial Cold War-era leaders, the police closed the case. And who?
Obviously, you know why he's considered controversial. He's considered controversial, which should be a red flag. Or not a red flag, but in our case, like the good red flag, as in a green flag, technically. If that makes sense.
Who really killed Olof Palme remains a mystery. Of course, to understand why someone would want to kill Olof Palme, we need to know.
Controversial isn't communist or controversial, not a communist, but a leftist. And no, not controversial as a Nazi. You think the CIA was executing Nazis during the Cold War? Or at least like, you think that's what was happening? No, they were fucking putting them in positions of power.
What he was wearing. Check the police report. It's accurate. We also need to know what kind of guy he was. So, who was Olof Palme? In short, he was a man of contradictions. Born in 1927 to a wealthy conservative family, Palme would go on to become one of the most consequential social democratic politicians in Swedish history. An aristocrat turned champion of the working class. Moreover, as a young man, when he traveled to America, he would spend a year studying at a fine liberal arts college before bumming it across the country as a hitchhiker. By the way, that school he went to, Kenyon College, pretty cool. Not that we're biased or anything. Anyways, to Palme, America was both an inspiration, possessing a remarkable spirit of equality and openness, and a cautionary tale, as inequality and racism showed the perils of failing to commit fully to one's ideals. But his travels didn't end there. In Eastern Europe, he grew to despise Soviet totalitarianism, and in Southeast Asia, he saw the colonized peoples of the world demanding recognition of their rights to self-determination. As he returned to Sweden, Palme knew one thing very clearly. The Sweden which raised him, which chose neutrality in World War II, and the Sweden which existed today, which chose silence in the Cold War, could no longer be tolerated. If Sweden wanted to practice politics of equality at home, it had to start doing so on the world stage, standing up for the downtrodden not just domestically, but internationally. As luck would have it, political opportunity fell right into his lap. As in 1951, Palme happened to meet then Prime Minister Tage Erlander on a chance train ride as he was traveling home, alone and among the ordinary folk, as social democratic politicians so often did. Erlander was immediately impressed with Palme, and soon enough, Palme was the Prime Minister's personal secretary. Over time, his responsibilities grew, and so did the public's awareness of his contradictions. Here was a social democratic politician campaigning for the everyman, but who was clearly not one of them. He came from a wealthy family for one, but more importantly, Palme was haughty and strident.
Classic, by the way. Oh, dude, I can't believe you care for the plight of the working class, and yet you come from a wealthy background. Oh my God. Seems to me like you are rife with contradictions. Seems hypocrite much? Hypocrite much?
A man of immense talent and capability, and who wasn't necessarily humble about it. Still, he overcame the criticism and became prime minister in 1969. Immediately, he sought to remake Sweden's foreign policy, abandoning quiet neutrality in favor of an aggressive third way between America and the Soviet Union. A fierce critic of American hypocrisy and Soviet horrors, all the same. The principle was simple. The downtrodden of the world had a friend in Olof Palme's Sweden.
These simple facts inevitably raise the question of equality, of a more equal distribution between countries and within countries. We are beginning to see the outlines of this problem and the consequences, but we are not yet ready to accept the full implications of international solidarity.
Americans have hypocrisy, but the
course,
Soviets have horrors. Yeah, I think this content creator is a little bit of a liberal, but it's fine. I don't give a shit.
Making such friends brings plenty of enemies. At home, as economic troubles began to worsen, critics regarded Palme as more interested in those suffering outside Sweden than within. Though he led his party to its first defeat in 40 years, only 6 years later, in 1982, he led a return to power and return to form, making Sweden into the country of support for South Africa's ANC in their fight against apartheid.
This was a big no-no.
Palme was a brilliant, difficult man. His aspirations were equality, democracy, and international fraternity, but at the same time, he liked the spotlight and was stubborn to a fault. Paradoxically, Palme desperately wanted to be like the people he fought so hard for. So, on that cold February night, Palme dismissed his security guard and set out to see a movie, as if he were just an ordinary citizen.
From the moment Olof Palme hit the ground, police were behind the curve. Multiple witnesses phoned emergency services immediately, but police were late to the crime scene, giving the killer crucial time to escape. Palme took minutes to identify, given Lisbeth's non-responsive state of shock, and at headquarters, police failed to put out a call for additional manpower, while Stockholm wasn't locked down until 3 hours after the murder.
That's just how interesting. I guess they just, they couldn't fire up the Volvos, dude. How curious.
At the crime scene, witness questioning was terribly disorganized. Several key witnesses with crucial testimony were sent home. The police perimeter was too small, and passers-by trampled over key evidence, including the bullet used to kill Palme. As time went on, maverick cops developed their own pet theories. The lead investigator was convinced that a leftist Kurdish group was behind the assassination. Now, this wasn't totally...
Dude, this is my favorite shit. They're like, when in doubt, blame the fucking Kurds is so funny. When in doubt, blame a ethnic minority.
Totally implausible at first, but he held on to it even as it became increasingly clear there was nothing really to go on. He even shut down an inquiry into Stig Engstrom, thinking his own theory needed the attention and resources. All this police misconduct snowballed, leaving an increasingly cold trail. The murder weapon, determined by ballistics investigations to be a .357 Magnum, was never found, despite there only being 10 such weapons missing under suspicious circumstances in the entire country. Even as more plausible suspects emerged, the evidence against them was often circumstantial. Capturing the killer started to look more and more unlikely, if not downright impossible. With little in the way of decisive detective work to narrow things down, the list of suspects in Olof Palme's murder is immense, running the gamut from completely deranged to highly plausible. Usually, intricate theories of tightly organized conspiracies end up on the deranged end of the spectrum, but in the case of Olof Palme, there's one such theory worth considering: the South African connection.
The motive is simple. Palma was the foremost political figure in the West supporting the fight against apartheid. For South Africa's white supremacist government, killing Palma could do wonders. So when Palma died, a few people did point at South Africa. But it wasn't actually until 1996, 10 years after the murder and 2 years after the end of apartheid, that the theory gained any steam. South African government was sorting through the crimes of the period. A former government agent named Eugene de Kock alleged that a spy known to have assassinated a number of anti-apartheid.
When you Google Olaf Palme's murder, here's a CI.gov article that comes up. Approved for release in 2010, the Executive Intelligence Review. Why did Moscow kill Premier Olaf Palme? The Science of Statecraft by Lyndon H. LaRouche. Founder and contributing editor Lyndon H. LaRouche Jr. Fucking Larouchites on top. This is the Executive Intelligence Review by it's a LaRouche paper that I mean it's just archived by the CIA. Anyway, let's continue.
Families, Craig Williamson, had orchestrated the Palma murder. Now, de Kock didn't say much else, but independent journalists have pieced together a story. As it goes, Williamson was selected for the job because he'd spent years infiltrating Swedish organizations which supported the ANC. Rather than pulling the trigger, he would keep his hands clean, providing resources and intel to a Swedish middleman who hated Palma and had the connections to recruit someone for the actual dirty work.
By the way, the reason why they're saying there's like so many conspiracies and it's like hard to target who it is because he had a lot of haters for some of the most unimaginable crimes of all time. Being a European leader that was anti-apartheid. I believe he was also anti the Israeli apartheid as well, if I recall correctly, and being aligned or non-aligned directly with NATO and Western influence in terms of its relationship with pro-Vietnam, and also, like I said, not being outwardly anti-USSR. So for that reason, for all of those reasons, he was definitely like, he was a social democrat, but he was anti-imperialist, or rather, he was legitimately anti-imperialist in the sense that he wasn't just like anti-imperialist in the way that you hear pro-Vietnamese, not pro-Vietnam. Yes, I meant pro-Vietnamese. Vietnamese liberation. What I mean is that he was, while still being critical of the USSR, he was still not entirely anti-USSR in comparison to his European counterparts, and that puts a lot of targets on your back. It's a broad swath. It creates a broad swath of haters, many of which do have the capability of assassinating you. So it's hard. It's hard to figure out. It's hard to figure out exactly who out of all of his haters was actually successfully pulling the trigger. Why not all of them?
Enter Bertil Whedon.
Wait, then why did Moscow kill him if he didn't hate them? Wait, no, dude. Bro, chatter, you are, oh God, our Mormon chatter Neek skit. Once again, I show you a Larouchite newspaper, and just because it was archived by the CIA, you immediately assume that this is a paper of record. Okay? a paper written by a psychopathic, like a psychopathic cult leader. And you immediately, just because it was archived by the CIA, go, it must be right. Like, it's not even, this isn't even the CIA's position. Okay? It's just archived by the CIA, and you still were like, yeah, it must be correct then. Mormons are so vulnerable to misinformation. Anyway.
An avowed Swedish right-winger who worked as a mercenary for Rhodesia's white supremacist government in the 1970s. Williamson and Whedon had met all the way back in 1980, and today stand accused of collaborating on the burglary of anti-apartheid activist offices in London, a charge which, if true, certainly helps paint the picture of these two men as international clandestine criminals. So, the South African government has a motive. Williamson and Whedon have the means. But what about opportunity? Here the theory gets a bit murky. Perhaps Whedon recruited a disaffected right-winger to do the job, someone without a lot of experience but with plenty of passion, and naive enough to take the fall if caught. Whoever the gunman, the theory goes, they would have been trailing Palma for some time, finally seen their chance that night after the movie, pulled the trigger, and fled.
How does this theory hold up? Well, there's a compelling motive, and Williamson was a serious guy, a bona fide killer. But it's pretty incomplete. Who actually pulled the trigger? There's not really much to say, despite some pretty rigorous journalistic work to figure it out. Not to mention, de Kock's accusation came at a time when former apartheid officials could get amnesty for their crimes by presenting evidence against each other. Now, that's not proof he was lying, but he would have had an incentive to do so. True or not, this theory tirelessly to deny recognition to an entire people, literally killing it in his way. Apartheid South Africa's intense need to suppress the recognition of millions was
testified to seeing someone outside the Grand Cinema before and after the screening and following the Palmas as they left. The search for the so-called Grand Man led police first to Ulf Spinners, a seedy character who claimed to know something about the murder, and more trouble, ultimately stabbing a drug dealer to death in 1970, an event which garnered him prison time and the nickname the Bayonet Killer. But about that alibi. Pedersen claimed Spinners had been staying at his apartment on the edge of town. That evening, Pedersen had taken the train downtown to visit the Oxen Club, which was owned by drug dealer Sigga Sedergren. He then left the club around 10 p.m., taking the train home to arrive at about 11:30. A plausible timeline given his apartment's distance from central Stockholm. It all made sense. In fact, this whole group of lowlifes appeared to be a dead end. But after 2 years of fruitless investigations and a decision to retrace their steps, the police noticed an oversight. They hadn't bothered to ask Sedergren if he'd even seen Pedersen that night at the club. So in 1988, the police asked Sedergren, who was, ironically, at the tail end of a prison stint, about the affair. As it happens, he hadn't seen Pedersen that night at all. He volunteered an explanation for the mix-up. Perhaps Pedersen had wanted to buy some drugs and stopped by Sedergren's apartment. He lived near the Grand Cinema. Now they had a suspect. So they sought out Ulf Spinners once more, who now disputed the very story which provided him an alibi for the murder, asserting that Pedersen hadn't returned home until 12:30, ample time to have committed the crime. It was time to talk to Pedersen. His alibi didn't change much, but it was now, a couple of years later, more detailed. He'd left in the early evening, gone to the Oxen Club, hung out with Sedergren and his girlfriend, where, incidentally, he'd signed an affidavit as a witness to their opening a shared bank account, gotten drunk, taken the train home, fallen asleep, passed his stop, and had to go all the way back home, thus explaining his late arrival. Except neither Sedergren nor his girlfriend testified to seeing Pedersen at the club that night. And that document existed, but was undated. Pedersen just might be their culprit. So the police set up a lineup.
Yeah, no, this is like police malpractice to the point of, to such a degree that it is literally, I think, straight up voluntary. Dude, a head of state doesn't get assassinated and then have like this level of malpractice. Like, it has to be intentional. Like, you know.
A key Grand Man witness and Olof Palme's son, Martin, who both testified to seeing someone follow the Palmes from the theater, picked out Pettersson, although quite tentatively. Then they called in Lisbeth Palme to view a video lineup. She refused to be anywhere near the killer, and she identified Pettersson, stating, "It's evident who it is." That was enough. Christer Pettersson was charged with the murder of Olof Palme. The trial that began in June of 1989 was a disaster for Pettersson. His defense lawyer was unnecessarily confrontational with Lisbeth Palme, who remained a sympathetic figure with the Swedish public. In fact, Pettersson was convicted almost exclusively on the basis of her testimony. However, the conviction wasn't unanimous, and Pettersson was granted an appeal. 2 months later, citing evidence of Lisbeth Palme's state of shock and unreliability, along with police misconduct in nudging her selection at the lineup, while lacking evidence for any clear motive for Pettersson, his appeal was successful. Christer Pettersson was innocent.
Without compelling new evidence, it was impossible to retry him, even as he made...
But they're cops. Is it ridiculous to think that they're just that incompetent? Not to that degree, no. Bro, they let people walk over the crime scene. What are we talking about? A head of state? This isn't like a fucking random, like, this isn't like a random robbery. Like, yeah, they're definitely very incompetent regardless, but like, that's an insane fucking assessment.
Made conspicuously self-incriminating remarks and media appearances, apparently motivated by compensation for his sensationalism. Pettersson died in 2004, leaving behind a frustrating trail of circumstantial evidence and unanswered questions. Maybe he had the means. Zettergren, who dealt not only in drugs but also weapons, claimed to have sold Pettersson a revolver which matched the forensic criteria. As for motive, the popular theory goes, ironically enough, Zettergren bore a passing resemblance to Palme, and for whatever reason, Pettersson had it out for him, like he did the last drug dealer he killed. As for opportunity, it's plausible he was hanging around the area of the theater and on a dark night could have mistaken Palme for Zettergren or someone else. However, the most compelling part of the story is merely how good a story it is. Palme was an extraordinary politician who just wanted to walk the streets of the city he loved with his wife as just an ordinary citizen. One can almost say, if Pettersson did it, that he got what he wanted, dying an anonymous, sudden death in a case of mistaken identity, as if he were nobody at all. But what if there were a more poetic ending? What if the suspect were also more credible, enough to even convince the police in 2020 to name him Palme's killer and close the case? Well, there is Stig Engström, the third eyewitness from the intro, the man whose story just kept changing.
Let's take a look at what he said to police the night of the murder. According to the notes, Engström had just finished work for the evening and had just come out into the street when he heard what he first thought was an exhaust bang. However, he soon saw that someone was lying on the ground and also that there were people around him. As he passed the alley by Tunnelgatan, he looked there. Against a lighted wall, he saw a man in his 20s wearing a dark blue jacket. A couple notes on Engström's timing and position. According to this telling, he's just outside 44 Sveavägen, roughly 50 to 60 meters away from the shooting when it occurs, and, according to Engström, he clocked out at 11:20 p.m. The shooting took place at approximately 11:21 and 20 seconds, so he would have had to clock out in the late seconds of 11:20 at the earliest if he really heard the shooting just outside his office. That is, as long as the time clock is accurate. So Engström says he heard a bang, then saw Palma surrounded by witnesses, and then saw a man lurking in Tunnelgaten. In fact, that's all pretty reasonable. Lars Jepsen, the second eyewitness from the intro, the man who chased the killer up the stairs, testified the same night to police, according to their notes, that he hesitated for a moment whether to rush down to the injured person or whether to pursue the perpetrator. He would later clarify that he crossed to the north side of Tunnelgaten before doing so, a crucial detail because this makes him visible from where Engström was standing. This is a vital point in Engström's alibi. If he really saw Lars, it makes his guilt very hard to believe. Recall that at the time Lars was standing in that spot, he testified the killer was already bounding up the steps and had made it some distance. To see Lars on the north side of Tunnelgaten would have been very difficult from anywhere other than where Engström claimed to be standing.
What about the rest of his statement? Well, he makes a few bizarre remarks, but they're ultimately explained with a little investigation. Unfortunately, there's just not enough time for two guys making monthly videos to get into all of that here, but if you want to learn more, supporters on our Patreon get access to our podcast, where we discuss things that don't make the cut for videos like this. Link in the description. So Engström's story makes enough sense. The problem is, he didn't stick to it.
First, his position at the time of the murder changed. The early notes imply he claimed he was 50 meters away when he heard the shooting, but he later claimed to be much closer, saying he'd walked with quick steps, almost half running, as he was in a hurry to get to the subway. When he was about 20 meters from the intersection at Tunnelgaten, he heard a bang. Part of the discrepancy may be attributed to the police abridging the story in the earliest notes, but there are bigger problems. If Engström was just 20 meters away and jogging, it's unlikely Anna, the intro's first eyewitness, Palma's first attendant, or Stefan could have gotten there before Engström. Further, Engström's jogging makes little sense, as he had plenty of time before the last train. Second, the timing started to get fuzzy too. In his third conversation with police, Engström attempts to explain his failure to register the gunshots appropriately by claiming that he was distracted, trying to look at his dark watch. But he'd never mentioned this detail before, and he'd just then clocked out of work. If he was worried about time, surely he would have taken a look at it then, before mistakenly assuming he needed to rush to the station. Finally, in successive statements, Engström expanded his own involvement in administering first aid to Palma, from casting himself as a helpless bystander to offering advice about how best to position the victim, all the way to actively attempting to turn him on his side. There are other examples, but these are the most conspicuous instances of apparent dishonesty, and they all have one thing in common: a persistent effort by Engström to establish himself closer to the crime and more involved in the aftermath. Put another way, if he were innocent, Engström's first story is perfectly credible. He left work, heard the shot, ran to the scene, and even saw Lars Jepsen where he's supposed to be, confirming the timing. End of story. So why lie? Well, perhaps he got lucky with his first story. Perhaps he'd caught a glimpse of Lars when Lars caught a glimpse of him. After all, Lars's description of the killer, middle-aged, dark down jacket, something like a cap on his head, and with a wide back, sounds rather like Engström, a heavy-set, middle-aged man who wore a dark coat and a cap the night of the crime. According to the 2020 police announcement, the motive is simple. Engström craved attention. A middle-aged guy working late nights in a dead-end job who strolled out into the street one night, exhausted and bitter, and saw a man who had it all. He was famous, beloved by many countrymen, a politician who had the confidence, the arrogance, to waltz around at night alone, as if nothing could touch him. But Stig had the chance to put him in his place, so he did. Of course, murder is rarely rewarded with adulation and fame.
Yeah, totally, dude. I mean, yeah. He found a fucking Magnum, 1 of 10. Like, that makes no sense. Dude, murdering someone in Sweden with a fucking weapon that there are only 10 missing total in the entire country sounds fucking crazy if your motive is just simply, fuck that guy.
Fame, but scorn and infamy. Unless you kill the Prime Minister of Japan. Check out our video on that.
That's a great fucking counter to the argument that you're making, which is that was an incredibly well thought out political assassination with a very obvious motive. Like, yeah, the amount of time and effort and pre-planning that went into literally even building the doohickey, you know, that is the exact opposite. There's a clear-cut motive.
Assassination after this one. So Engstrom fled. Dissatisfied, he sought the limelight, telling the police a story that made him seem important. But it wasn't enough. He even complained to his wife the police weren't paying attention to him. In response, he changed his story and inflated his role. So he's got a plausible motive, but what about means and opportunity? It turns out Engstrom had a neighbor acquaintance who collected guns and owned a revolver which fit the forensic search criteria, so he could have had means. As for opportunity, a building employee testified that the time clock, essential to Engstrom's alibi, was 1 minute fast, meaning that if Engstrom's time card showed 11:20 p.m., he really clocked out at 11:19. Much too early for his story to make sense, and early enough to spot the Palmas walking down the street, tail them, and commit the crime. Engstrom begins to look like quite a believable suspect. Except another building employee claimed the time clock was 1 minute slow, which means Engstrom would have really clocked out at 11:21. Perfectly in time for his original story to add up, and late enough to make it impossible for him to shoot Palma. The police never tested the time clock.
Once again, his original story was perfectly believable. So why lie? Well, perhaps the police are right about Engstrom's character, even if he didn't kill Palma. He was an early arrival to a freshly murdered prime minister, but was ignored by police on account of lacking any useful information. So he changed his story and exaggerated his role to gain attention. Simple and believable. In effect, this motive cuts both ways, explaining his behavior whether he's guilty or innocent. In fact, most people on both sides of his case point to his attention-seeking as the primary motive for his behavior. Yet again, a frustratingly inconclusive theory. But while the case for Engstrom's guilt is riddled with holes, it has some convincing moments, perhaps most of all because it offers an even more poetic ending than Pedersen. An extraordinary man of great importance walks the streets alone, pretending to be ordinary. Not only does he die an anonymous death, a sort of wish ironically granted, he's gunned down by his polar opposite, an ordinary man who thought with the pull of a trigger he could change his fate, become extraordinary. And here we are, almost 40 years later and thousands of miles, still talking about the lowly Stig Engstrom. Whether Palma was killed by a villainous secret agent, a hapless drug addict, or a hopeless loser, the story of his death is a fascinating one.
Yeah, it's definitely the first thing. I don't know what. Like, I just don't. I don't know.
Of course, there's the extraordinary drama of it all.
Yeah, it is the position of the Swedish government.
Walking alone on a cold, dark February evening, the shadowy gunman slipped.
Something's narrative salience is irrelevant to its veracity. This is an insane way to talk about a real crime. I get it's something that could just been sitting around forever like JFK, but this isn't that. Now is not a time to have a meta conversation about the conversation about the subject. Wait, what do you mean? You're mad that he's like spinning off and talking about how about liberal democracy